Good morning, everybody. Happy pre-4th of July weekend. Hope you're having a great weekend. The heat's great, except when there's 70% humidity, right? That adds to the fun. Hey, we're in this series, What Makes You Happy? What makes you happy? I don't know what you think makes you happy. Maybe going to the beach, maybe sunshine, maybe vacation, maybe golfing, maybe buying something, or going shopping. I know sometimes ladies think that makes you happy. But last week, if you weren't with us, we said something very specific that makes us happy. And so some of you weren't here, and so I'm going to give you, a bye on this one. But others of you were here, and I'm going to test you, and I'm just going to let you know that Greensburg did pretty good. So, okay, so what makes you happy? You guys did better, but they did good too. All right, yeah, that's right. We said no thing makes you happy because happiness is not attached to a what, it's attached to a who. And the happiest times of our lives weren't because we got a happy what or we bought a happy what and it just suddenly made us happy. It's because of the who's that we had surrounding us, the people, because happiness is tied to a who. Now, we're in this series, What Makes You Happy, and it's possible that you feel a little bit of a tension, particularly if you grew up in church, because it seems like in church we're not supposed to feel happy, right? I don't know if you felt that tension before. Sometimes God's pitted against happiness, and maybe you've even heard the phrase, God isn't interested in you being happy. He's interested in you being holy, right? And he doesn't want you to be happy. It's not about happiness. God is concerned with your holiness. And as a kid growing up, you go to church on Sunday and you're taught, you're supposed to be holy, but then you go with your friends and you're supposed to be happy. And we had a song that we learned at Vacation Bible School. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands, right? But for many of us, our experience was if you're happy and you know it, repent, okay? Because you're not supposed to be happy. God is not interested in your happiness. He's interested in your holiness. And I get that. And so you might be thinking, this is bad. I can't believe we're doing this series. There's something not right about this. And so if you feel that way, there's a question that I want you to wrestle with, and I want you to just think about. And the question is, where do you think your capacity for happiness comes from? If we want to be happy, and I actually believe that none of us in life is really on a truth quest, we're all on a happiness quest. We all want to be happy. So why is that? Where does that desire for happiness come from? And my argument would be that I think God put it in there in the first place, and he actually wants us to be happy. But our problem with happiness is that our pursuit of happiness away from God and away from the things of God, really it results in unhappiness, doesn't it? Our pursuit of happiness away from God and away from the things of God results in our unhappiness, and that's really kind of where the problem lies, and so we're going to get into that a little bit this morning. And it's possible that you're here today and you left church a while ago and you're just kind of recently coming back, but the reason you left is because you were told you had to either be happy or holy, but you couldn't be both. And so if you want to be holy, then you're going to have to be happy somewhere else, and vice versa. And so I think if that's the case, then you were caused to make a false choice, because I don't think it's really like that. In fact, we have images of happiness in our culture, right? People try to encourage us to pursue happiness. We're told to look at the celebrities and the rock stars and sometimes politicians, although not so much the politicians, but we're told to look at all these famous people and see the things that they're doing because they can pursue happiness at levels that you and I can only dream about because they have so much wealth, they have so much power, so many things at their fingertips. And so they're pursuing happiness, they're trying to find it. And yet the thing that we discover is that they're not particularly happy people. I mean, rarely a week goes by where you don't read about some big celebrity breakup and they're on spouse number 4 and, they're addicted to drugs, they're ODing, some are committing suicide. I mean, there's all kinds of issues. Some are paying for a doctor to come in and help them go to sleep at night, and then that same doctor administers different medication to wake them up in the morning. That doesn't sound like happy to me, right? Even though we're told to go buy their stuff and live the way that they're living and pursue the lives that they're living, and we realize that there's not happiness at the end of that. There's just emptiness. So it seems like happiness has to be a little bit different than that. And it's so interesting as I talk to people who have started coming to church here, I never hear somebody say, I was holy and miserable at the same time. But what I do hear people say, and about 4 months ago, we sat down with a person who shared their story, and they said, I was pursuing happiness, and I was miserable. I was pursuing happiness, and I was miserable. So it seems like if God created us with this capacity for happiness, he perhaps has also created a way for that to be fulfilled through him, and that the path toward happiness will also lead us toward holiness, and the path toward holiness will also lead us in the direction of happiness. So what do happiness and holiness have to do with each other? I think a lot. And I think Jesus spoke to that very clearly. And so this morning, I want to take some time to look at what Jesus said along the lines of what makes you happy, what makes us happy. So if you've got your Bible, we're going to be in the book of Matthew. Matthew is the first book of the New Testament. I'm going to invite you to turn there. We're going to look at a sermon that Jesus delivered. We don't know if it was one particular sermon or if it was a series of sermons, or some people actually think it was just regular content that Jesus delivered on a regular basis as he taught and ministered to people. He kind of shared these concepts. What we do know is that Jesus didn't have a bulletin, and he didn't hand it out that said, Sermon on the Mount, and so now you're going to sit down and I'm going to deliver the Sermon on the Mount. It was a little bit different than that. But in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, there's a section known as the Beatitudes, and perhaps you've heard of this before. Beatitude just means supreme blessedness, and actually, you may not know this, but the New Testament was originally written in Greek, not in English. And so as we read through the New Testament, there are some translation issues at times or questions, or there's a lack of clarity, particularly when you're translating into English, which is a very imprecise language. And so sometimes we look at Greek words, and one particular word I want to look at today is the word that gets translated into blessed or blessed. Maybe you heard it pronounced as blessed. It's these 8 blessed statements or blessed statements that Jesus spoke at the very beginning of his Sermon on the Mount to help answer the question, what makes us happy? What makes you happy? And so the Greek word that gets translated into the English word blessed is the word makarios, which just means fortunate or happy. You may not have known that it can be translated as happy. And the idea is it's someone who's experiencing favorable circumstances in life, a happy person. And so what we're going to see is Jesus gave us 8 of these statements, and I'll warn you up front, it's going to be a little bit like drinking from a fire hydrant because there is so much here. In fact, we probably could have made this like 8 weeks individually on each one of these Beatitudes, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to kind of cram them all into one. But there are a couple things you're probably going to notice about them. The first one is this, that what Jesus said was completely countercultural. It's countercultural today. You're not going to hear anybody outside of the church saying these things or instructing you along these lines. But it was also countercultural 2,000 years ago. When the Jewish people heard Jesus teaching, it was completely countercultural because for the Jewish people, they focused very much on outward behaviors, right? It was about obeying laws and offering the right sacrifices and being cleansed on the outside. But as you begin studying Jesus and the things that Jesus said, he was far more concerned about what was taking place on the inside. And so these things, though they're completely countercultural, are not necessarily outward behaviors, but they're attitudes of the heart. They're a direction that you move your life in, but it begins on the inside, and then over time it begins to work its way to our outside. So that's kind of the first thing. The next thing is it's not really a to-do list. Okay, this isn't like a checklist. You do it and you're done with it once you've accomplished it. Just so you know, there's no arrival point in the Christian life this side of heaven. So there's no point where we get and we're like, hey, I've gotten there. I've done everything I need to do. And Jesus looks at me and smiles, I'm perfect. That doesn't happen this side of heaven. So it's not really a to-do list. It's not a measuring rod of how great or not great of a Christian you are or follower of Jesus you are. And then the third thing is this. It's really a list of contrasting ideas, particularly contrasting ideas from what we are told in this world. We're told that the cocky people, the powerful people, the rich people, the strong people, that they're the happy people. And yet what we're going to discover is Jesus had a far different take on the whole concept and understanding of happiness. So, what does Jesus tell you, me, us, it means to be happy? Let's take a look here. Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 1, he says this. Matthew actually is recording this for us. Matthew said, "Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them." Now, typically, there were a lot of different groups that were surrounding Jesus. There are often the crowds, and that's just all the people who surrounded Jesus, wanted to know what Jesus was about, and were kind of interested and curious. And then there were the disciples. Those were ones who truly were followers of Jesus, who wanted to listen and know and understand. And then there was this kind of inner circle. They were the apostles. They were the specific 12 that Jesus called to be his followers and invited to follow him, and they're the ones who ended up leading the early church. And so Jesus is talking to more of the disciple group, kind of the middle-sized group of people, followers. It's likely Matthew was present to be able to record this for us. So here's what he says. He said to them, verse 3, he says, "Blessed are, or happy are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." So right out of the gate, I mean, Jesus kind of addresses this myth of happiness that rich people are happy people. Or rich people are not happy people, or poor people are happy people, or poor people are unhappy people. It doesn't really matter what you have physically. It doesn't necessarily make you happy. Jesus says it comes down to being poor in spirit. And what exactly does that mean? Because if you were to talk to a poor person and say, "Is your poverty of benefit to you?" nobody would probably say yes. Yes, I'm thankful that I'm in poverty. But when a person is in poverty, they cannot rely on what they have because they don't have anything, right? And so a person who is poor in spirit is a person who stands before God and says, "I cannot rely on what I have because I have nothing. I am poor in spirit." And what Jesus is saying is really there are two types of people in the world. There's one who stands before God and is proud and says, "Look at me, look at all that I've accomplished for you. I'm so great, welcome me in." And then there's the second type, and that's the humble type, and that's the person who says, "I have nothing. God, I'm nothing without you. I am dependent on your mercy. I am dependent on your grace." And it's those people, it's that second group of people who are blessed, who are happy, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. They're the ones who get to experience God because they stand before him in humility. But the other group, Jesus is basically saying, look, the moment you begin to trust in yourself, the moment you begin to trust in your deeds or your riches or your stunning good looks or your trophy wife or your awesome husband or your children or whatever else, the moment you begin trusting in yourself, you're excluded because that's not a place of happiness. And do you know why that's not a place of happiness? Because as soon as I begin to depend on myself, that means I'm responsible for me. And the responsibility begins falling on my shoulders, and suddenly I have to begin trying to control things, don't I? I have to try and make sure that, I've got the great job, I've got the good-looking spouse, I've got the, great kids and whatever else. And so suddenly there's pressure and there's responsibility, and the fact is, as we get older in life, we begin to learn we have very little control over things, don't we? We have very little control. We can influence, but ultimately control rests on someone and something else. And so a person who's poor in spirit recognizes that and comes before God and says, "God, I am nothing without you. I am nothing without you." In fact, I think one of the best ways you could start your day is to get on your knees before God and declare your dependency on him. Say, "God, I'm nothing without you. I am nothing without you." It's not about my money. It's not about my career. It's not about my family, my kids, my looks, whatever. I need you. And Jesus says when you do that, and again, remember, this is totally countercultural, but when you do that and when you depend on God, Jesus says there is a place of happiness for you. Going on, verse 4, he says, "Blessed are," or happy are, "those who mourn, for they will be comforted." Now that's kind of funny because it's almost insensitive, right? You kind of want to tap Jesus on the shoulder and say, "Do you realize what you just said there? That doesn't even make sense. Blessed are those who mourn." We don't like the concept of mourning. We don't like to talk about mourning. We don't like to be around people who are mourning. We don't like to go to funerals, right? We don't like to think about people. We don't like to think about death and dying. It's much easier to kind of sanitize things and send somebody away where we never have to see them again. I realize sometimes there are reasons to send people away, but sometimes it's like, I don't want to see you again, cut the ties and whatever else, and I don't want to show up and because it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable, and yet years before this, Solomon, who was the wisest man next to Jesus, said it's better to go to the house of mourning than to a house of feasting, and that death is the destiny of all, and the living should take this to heart. Because people who mourn and people who grieve have an understanding that life is temporary. Life on this earth is temporary. I'll never forget when I was a college student, my freshman year in college, we were in a chapel service and the president of our college was speaking and he had just lost a close friend. And he was grappling with the question of, is it better to love and lose or to never love at all? Because it was painful, losing people. Coming to the understanding that this world is broken, that there is death and dying in this world is painful. But he ultimately came to the conclusion and encouraged us along the lines, say it's better to love and to lose than to never love at all. And people who are willing to mourn and who understand mourning and grief and the nature of this world, they experience comfort because they know this world isn't the end. They know that there's hope, that the wrong will fail, the right will prevail, that God will come through, that there is hope on the other side of the grave, and that everything that is broken will be restored. Those who are mourn understand that this world is seemingly kind of random, and death isn't an if, it's a when. And as a result, they experience rich relationships, and they know God's presence as they go through difficult times of grief. Verse 5, he continues on. He says, blessed are or happy are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Now that word meek is kind of a funny word. I've actually never heard it outside of the church or outside of a Christian context. Has anybody heard the word meek outside of a church context? Just curious. Yeah, I mean, when you think about meek, I mean, I have 2 girls, and I'm not praying that they marry a meek husband, or, as we think about, electing a president, we don't want a meek president because we assume and we associate meekness with weakness, right? But that's actually a misunderstanding of the definition. A meek person has a proper understanding and estimation of themselves within the context of God's creation and love. A meek person, in other words, understands that that person is not God. They understand that if God is God, then I cannot also be God. And if God is at the center of my life, then I cannot also be at the center of my life. And so meekness isn't weakness. There may be weak, meek people, or there could be powerful, meek people. A meek person uses whatever power has been given to him or her for the good of other people. Not to build themselves up, not to push their own agendas, not to strive for, helping themselves along, but they use their strength and their power for the good of others because they understand that this world is not about them in the first place. They don't domineer. In fact, this is, I think, an important thing, so if you fell asleep, wake up. And that is, self-assertion is not a Christian virtue. Self-assertion and self-assertiveness, it's not a Christian virtue. That is pride, that is arrogance, and that is the exact opposite of what Jesus did when he gave his life by dying on the cross. And so Jesus says those who are meek, they embrace the reality that they are not at the center, that there is someone bigger than themselves in this world. And so they center their lives on God. And they have this virtue that we've seemed to have lost in our culture, and that's humility. They have a real sense of humility. Do you know any proud, happy people? Not generally. I haven't met too many of them. And so Jesus says, blessed are the meek, for they'll inherit the earth. He goes on, verse 6, blessed or happy are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Now, this is kind of a fascinating one, and he's not talking about food and drink here, right? He's talking about righteousness, and what is righteousness? It's doing the right thing, right? It's choosing the right path in life, making wise, right, good, godly decisions in life. And another way of saying this would be happy are those with no guilt and no regret and clear consciences, right? Happy are those with no guilt, no regret, and clear consciences. Because those people understand that sin kills things. It kills my relationship with myself. We talked about this last week. Sin kills my relationship with me. It kills my relationship with other people. It kills my relationship with God. And so those who hunger and thirst for righteousness and for making right decisions, they're constantly moving in the direction of God. Have you ever regretted doing the right thing? Not generally. I can't think of a time when I have. In fact, growing up, my grandma had a poster in one of her rooms that said, the truth will set you free, but first it may make you miserable, right? And there's some truth to that, isn't there? It might be easier to lie at first, but then you have the consequences. Then you have to have another lie to cover that up, and then there's regret, and then there's not a clear conscience. And when you go to bed at night, you're thinking about all this, and even though it may be painful to tell the truth at the front end, there's peace on the other end, isn't there? And there's happiness in that place. But have you ever regretted doing the wrong thing? Oh, yeah. I mean, if you could go back and redo high school, I don't think any of us would say, I wish I had been drinking and partying more. I just didn't spend enough time doing those things. I wish I had dated more people, slept around a little bit more. I wish I had, pursued more relationships. I wish I had skipped work more. If I could go back and do that job, I shouldn't have showed up so often. Whenever we do the wrong thing, we suffer consequences. And it breaks our peace with others, with ourselves, and with God, and we don't have a clear conscience. And regret comes when we know right and we choose to do what's wrong. And so Jesus says, pursue righteousness. Do the right thing. You'll find yourself being happy. It kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Even though it's countercultural, it's certainly intuitive. As we've all admitted, we don't regret doing what's wrong. He goes on, verse 7. He says, blessed are, or happy are, the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. So what does it mean to be merciful? It really means being relationally generous. It means being relationally generous. We talked about this a little bit last week. It means not holding on to bitterness, not holding on to anger, being willing to forgive. Have you ever known a happy, bitter person? I worked with not a happy, bitter person. I worked with a very bitter person years ago. And this person was absolutely miserable. Living with somebody who didn't want to marry him and doing work that they didn't want to do. And when we came into work on the same day, it was misery for everybody. There's no happiness in that spot. There's no peace in that spot. It's intuitive again, but we forget. The merciful will be shown mercy. But have you met somebody who, had a husband walk out or a wife walk out or lost their kids or there was some difficult thing that they overcame in life, and you look at that and you say, you should be so bitter, or you should be so angry, or why didn't you try and get revenge on them? They deserved it. And they haven't done those things. They're just at peace. You look at that and you say, they were relationally generous. They gave him, they gave her, they gave them exactly what they didn't deserve. And even though that person never came and said, please forgive me, or apologized for what they had done, they were willing to cancel the debt that was owed, the relational debt that was owed, and they moved forward in life. But we know this. If you're not relationally generous, you can go to your dying breath with bitterness and anger and unkind thoughts. Happy are the merciful, the relationally generous. Now the next one is kind of a fascinating one, and it's one that I don't think gets highlighted maybe enough. And it really kind of begins to answer an important question, and the question is this: why can't I see God? Have you ever thought that before in your life? Why can't I see God? I'm praying, I want direction, I want clarity, I want God to help me with a decision or a situation. I want to be able to see him, and yet I can't, and I'm not getting any answers, and sometimes that's frustrating. In fact, it can be a reason why people, abandon God, because I prayed to him, and he didn't answer me, and I didn't get any answers that I was interested in. It's like Jesus baits us in with that question and says, do you want to see God, in your situation, in your relationship? Do you want some answers? Do you want some clarity? Of course we'd say yes. Of course we'd answer yes. So here's what he says. Check this out. Verse 8, he says, blessed are, or happy are the pure in heart, for they will see God. The pure in heart are the ones who are able to see God. Now, what's fascinating about this is we live in a culture that doesn't value purity, except when it comes to water, right? We want our water to be pure. But aside from that, we don't even talk about purity. We mock it. We make fun of it, whether it's ethical purity or sexual purity or relational purity or motivational purity. But the truth is, if you can think back to a situation where you just, couldn't see clearly and you got yourself in a mess and you say, why did I do that? Or why did I date him or her? Or why did I say yes to that business deal? Or what was I thinking? I wish I could have seen clearly. The truth is probably there was a lack of purity in your life that fogged your vision and kept you from seeing purity. But Jesus says that purity paves the way to clarity, and purity opens the door to clarity. And if you want to see God and his ways, you've got to pursue purity in your life. And it could be you're at a point where, you're trying to make a decision and you're not sure where to go in the future, or if you should be dating this person, or where this relationship's going, or whether this business thing is a good thing or not. And you want clarity, but Jesus invites us to pursue purity, and when we do that, he gives us clarity. So it's when we pursue purity in our relationships, when we pursue purity in our motives, right? I mean, you know people who don't have pure motives. Of course they're not going to see God. When we pursue purity in our thoughts, when we pursue purity in our internet usage, when we pursue purity in our social media usage, in our conversations about others, it's when we look in the direction and move our lives in the direction of purity that God begins to give us clarity. And do you know why that is? Because God is the most pure being there is. And so as we move away from purity, God doesn't dwell in those spaces. So as we move in the direction of purity, it's then that we begin to see God and we understand God's ways and we know God. Again, no one in our culture tells us to do that. We mock purity. But if you choose to pursue it, you'll see him. Verse 9, he says, blessed are or happy are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Now, do you know why they're called the children of God? Because if you choose to make peace, you're doing exactly what your heavenly Father has done. God wants peace with you, and he sought to make a peace with you by sending Jesus down to die on the cross for us. And so when you choose to make peace, you're doing the very thing that God has done, and you're becoming like God in your behavior. You're becoming a child of God. And let me ask you this, do you know any happy troublemakers? Anyone? Know of any happy protesters, right? Get bussed from protest to protest? They seem happy. They seem like happy people, don't they, right? I mean, you can think of a person who's stirring up trouble at work or maybe in your neighborhood or at school or if you're in college, at the fraternity or sorority. I mean, we think of trouble. We know troublemakers, and you ask the question, why do they create trouble? It's because they're unhappy and they want other people to be unhappy too. But Jesus says, happy are the peacemakers. Those who look at a relational brokenness or a relationship that's breaking or broken and they say, I'm going to help make peace in this situation. Not a peace faker, but a peacemaker, somebody who steps in and says, I want there to be something different here. And Jesus says the reconcilers, those who reconcile. Now, isn't that true? Again, I mean, you think to yourself, how did Jesus know this 2,000 years ago? How did he know what would be relevant to our lives 2,000 years later? And if you're wrestling with your understanding of whether or not Jesus is truly the Son of God, I just invite you to read his words, because no human could make these things up. No human has that much wisdom. And yet Jesus constantly invited people who weren't sure yet that he was the Son of God to follow him and to move in his direction. And so I'd encourage you to do the same. And so you can see how these begin to make sense. If life's all about me, then I'm not going to be happy. When I pursue doing the right thing, I'll be happy. When I begin, maybe pursuing purity, maybe that's a bit of a stretch for you. You can see how a lack of purity perhaps led to a lack of clarity in your life. But when we get to this last one, and here's the last blessed statement, it's a little bit confusing. Here's what he says. Verse 10, he says, blessed are or happy are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, what's funny about that is we don't think about the words persecuted and happiness or blessed and persecuted in the same sentence, do we? I mean, those things seem like totally opposing thoughts. Like if you're, honest in your work and you get fired, you don't feel very happy or blessed. Or if everyone else is cheating on the test and you decided to take the high road and not use the cheat sheet, and then your GPA drops and you're flunk out of the class or whatever, you don't feel blessed because of that. So when we think about being blessed and being persecuted, those two things don't really go hand in hand, but there's a bigger point that Jesus was making, and I think it becomes clear, especially as we grow older in life, and if you spend time reading through the New Testament, it especially becomes clear. And it's this very thought, that you are going to face difficulty in life, period. You're going to face difficulty if you do right, and you're going to face difficulty if you do wrong. And you can only be happy on one side of that equation, right? I mean, if you're persecuted for doing the wrong thing because you made decisions that had consequences and they took you down a path that you didn't want to go on, and then you face difficulty because of that, then you've also got an upset relationship with God and potentially yourself and other people. There's no happiness there. But if you do the right thing and you face consequences for doing the right thing, you can still put your head on the pillow at night because you know you did the right thing. You can still be at peace with your Heavenly Father. You can still be at peace with yourself, and very often you can be at peace with other people because you know you did what was right. And so Jesus understood that very important precept and concept and said, blessed are those who are persecuted for doing what's right, for theirs is the kingdom. They begin to experience God's presence. They know God. Now, as I said, these 8 things, it's like drinking from a fire hydrant, right? Can you do all 8 of those today? Go home and do that today. No, but there is a common denominator. There's a common thread that goes through all of these things. And simply this, that happiness is an outcome. Happiness is an outcome. It's not immediately accessible, but it's ultimately accessible. It's not like you weren't happy when you came in at 10:55, but now, bam, you're happy. It doesn't work like that. Happiness is a direction. Happiness is decisions and time compiled together and compounded together and moving you in a direction. There are no quick fixes. In fact, if anybody promises you quick fix happiness, your red flag should go up, and you should be aware that you can't. That's why we said last week you can't market real happiness, because it's an outcome. It's something that happens over time. In fact, I think one of our culture's problems right now is that we are convinced that everything good in life is quick and easy. And yet Jesus said the exact opposite. As I said, these are attitudes of the heart. This is moving in a direction and experiencing God's presence and movement as you move in that direction. And so Jesus, if you were to ask him, what makes you happy? Jesus would say, you sow and you reap your way to happiness over time. Just as you sow and reap your way to unhappiness over time. And if you're in here and you're unhappy, we could probably, if you were really honest, admit that you didn't get there overnight. You didn't arrive at unhappy overnight, just as you don't arrive at happy overnight, but it's a process. And it's a movement in a direction, and it's a path you walk down. But the good news is this, that Jesus says if you're at the place of unhappy, you can sow and reap your way out of it. And you can sow and reap your way in the direction of happiness. And it may mean making some different decisions in life and walking down different pathways and putting God again at the center of who you are, and choosing that this life isn't really about you, and being willing to mourn and grieve and recognize the reality of this world. It might mean beginning to pursue purity. It might mean making a different decision about who your roommate is, or, the subscriptions that you have, or, moving into a different city. I don't know. But by God's grace, you can arrive at a point of happiness, because happiness isn't so far out of our grasp as we may think. It becomes the attitudes of the heart that move us in the direction of happiness over time. Now, what's really fascinating, Jesus ended this whole Sermon on the Mount, because after that last beatitude, he summed up the last one in a couple more verses, but we're not going to look at that. And then he switched to different content. He moved on, but when he got to the very end, he summed it up with a very famous parable. That's a parable we've taught on here before. You've heard it probably before, even if you're not a church person. There's a song about it. I've taught to my kids. But take a look at what he says in this parable. Matthew chapter 7, verse 24. He said, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine, which they had all done, they had all been sitting there for the sermon, anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into, what's the word up there? Practice. Practice. In other words, not just a person who hears and walks away, or not a person who hears and said, wow, that was really good, I really like that, thanks for that, or a person who thinks they get credit for showing up and call mom because I was actually in church today, and I get credit for that. But a person who actually takes it to heart and does something with it, he said, is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And we all know that to build a house, it takes time, right? It takes time and energy, especially if you want to build a good foundation under that house. You got to spend some good time on that. And nothing necessarily changes immediately, but something changes eventually. And over time, as you build that house, it withstands the pressures and the storms of life, because Jesus then talks about a storm coming down. But then he contrasts it with somebody else. Verse 26, he says, but everyone who hears these words of mine, so they heard them just like the first group, anyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice. In other words, a person who says, that sounds really nice, I'm not really sure that's for me, I really like that idea, but, it seems like a lot of work, or that was 2,000 years ago. What does Jesus know about happiness today? I'm not going to do that. I showed up, I should get points. He says that person is deceiving himself or herself. He said, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. And so immediately Jesus says, look, there's no value in just hearing. There's no value in just showing up. The value comes when you do it. The value comes when you put it into practice. The value comes when you give it a try and apply. Showing up and hearing a great sermon and nodding to yourself and even taking notes and thinking, boy, that sounds really good. You know, I like that. Or I'll point my friend to that. They should hear that. Or my mom or dad or whoever it is. That's nice, but it's of no value. The value comes in the doing. The doing. The doing. So if you take nothing else from this morning, please, please, please remember, happiness is an outcome. And you sow and you reap your way there over time. One of the things I am so passionate about, and one of the things that thrills me so much is that Jesus has given this invitation to us. One of the reasons why I love leading this church, what I'm excited about, what we are passionate about as a church, why I tell you invite friends to come because they need to hear this and they need to know that Jesus has pointed the way to happiness. And he has invited us to follow. And anyone who's willing to follow and to discover that over time we can sow and we can reap our way to happiness. And it is within our grasp, but it is not immediate. It's ultimate. So, what makes you happy? Last week we said, no thing. And this week, what makes you happy? Sowing. Good, thank you. No thing and sowing. It almost rhymes. Now next week, my good friend, my mentor, Dick Towner is going to be here, and he brings 80 years of incredible wisdom to share with us as we continue on in this series. I hope you'll be here. But as you think about these kind of 8 principles of happiness, I know it's overwhelming. Choose one. Go home this afternoon, read through Matthew chapter 5. What's one area where God might be inviting you to begin sowing toward happiness? And what you'll discover is not immediately, but eventually, you will begin to know happiness in a way you've never known it before. Let me pray for us. God, thanks for these words that have been preserved for us for 2,000 years. It just astounds me because I can't think of a single human who would be smart enough to come up with these concepts. And yet at the same time when we hear them, we think, gosh, it makes sense. Why didn't I see that more clearly? And so God, I just pray for the person in here who is maybe at a very unhappy place. I pray that you would begin helping him or her to make decisions to move in a pathway toward happiness, to begin surrounding themselves with you, putting you at the center, making wise decisions, pursuing righteousness, pursuing purity, gaining clarity. Lord, I just thank you for this challenge. I just ask that you would speak to each one of us. Help us to know where we need to move forward, how we need to trust you more, and help us to know happiness. Give us wisdom to know what we need to do, and then, Father, give us the courage to follow through with it and do it. I ask these things in the matchless name of Jesus. Amen.